what's up, everybody? We're going to be talking to the extraordinary Dr. Peter Attia today. I'm very excited to bring him to you guys. He is somebody that we've had on the show a few times. He's also somebody that I know personally, and I think he's a super extraordinary dude. So he'll be giving us some insights into COVID-19, what's going on from a medical perspective, what's going on in the healthcare system, what we can do to protect ourselves, all that good stuff. So he should be joining us any minute. Again, we're going to be joined by Dr. Peter Attia today. If you guys haven't seen the episodes, I can't remember if we've had him on multiple times or not, but just a super extraordinary guy. I've known him now for many years, wow, and is just an incredible thinker. He's done an amazing TED Talk too, by the way. So yeah, super smart guy, very well versed in all things medicine related, the human body, longevity, all of that stuff. He's also an extraordinary concierge doctor, so he works with a lot of people doing some pretty in-depth analysis of the human body and what it responds to in terms of living a high quality life for as long as humanly possible. And so he is going to be joining us this morning. There he is. What's up, dude?
Hey man, how are you?
I'm good. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I imagine you're doing this all day long now with people, given your expertise. And how have you been approaching learning about COVID-19?
Well, luckily we've got a research team that's sort of spent the last, 5-6 years thinking about longevity, which is completely unrelated to this, but at least we have the infrastructure in place of a team that can be basically redirected. So it's super hard. We have to basically pivot every other day. And if I think about what we've learned in the last 4 weeks, it's staggering. And if I also think about how many times we thought we knew and understood something only to realize a few days later, nope, that's probably not correct. So we have many different things that we're pursuing. And on top of that, we've got people who are now volunteering to help us. We've got, guys that work at hedge funds that would normally be modeling, market scenarios that are saying, how can we help? And so now they're helping build the models that we're using to try to understand spread. And we've got other people who, medical students, pre-meds that normally, do volunteer work that are saying, hey, how can I help contribute to these efforts with respect to doing research? So it's been, in that sense, it's been actually quite humbling to see how much people just want to help.
That's actually really extraordinary. And look, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but watching people come together, seeing the outpouring of people really trying to help make other people's lives better it's a pretty cool response. So walk me through, you've talked about how a day in the life of COVID-19 is like a month anywhere else. What have we learned in the last couple of days that maybe we didn't understand before, like you were saying, that people should be aware of?
Well, I think we are probably seeing that there is some evidence of lasting immunity. So that's one piece of good news, is that people who are recovering from this, based on some animal data, at least should have some protection, at least for the year. Coronaviruses are kind of different viruses, and we generally don't get lasting immunity from them. The mild ones, at least, people did get lasting immunity from the really severe ones that caused SARS in 0304 and MERS. This is probably going to be somewhere in between. That's going to probably become relevant over the coming year. I think the other thing that we're learning is that we still don't really have an effective drug strategy that's been truly vetted. In other words, we have lots of anecdotal stuff. We have a lot of what's called off-label use and open-label use, which means things that are being tested but without randomized controlled trials that look somewhat safe and somewhat promising. But the reality of it is we don't yet have a fully vetted strategy around drugs. I think the other thing we're seeing is that, New York does probably look like it's headed for a real stress on its healthcare delivery system. Our view a week ago today was that it would probably happen within 1 to 2 weeks, which means, sometime this week, our projections, if they were half right, would suggest that there's really going to be a mismatch between how many people need medical care in New York and how many don't. The data as of last night were basically about 1,000 deaths in New York, but they're disproportionately in the boroughs. So how does one interpret that? Well, we interpret that to mean that the people in the boroughs were the most affected to begin with, because they were probably the ones that were most in the subways commuting into and out of the city. So actual deaths in Manhattan of those 1,000 were probably less than 200. So it's still, I think, a bit too soon to say. But unfortunately, if I had to guess, I think the number of infected people in New York is much higher than we realize now.
Mm. And so what can people be doing to protect their immune system? Or is that sort of a joke and don't even focus on that, just focus on isolation? What's the best strategy right now for staying safe?
I think it's all of the above. I do think that there's probably nothing that beats, robust social distancing, both at the individual level and obviously at the societal level for the short term. We're seeing the economic consequences of that are probably much more grave than certainly than I expected or understood. I kind of had this realization in talking with a bunch of people, and you can think about this because you understand how businesses work. I'm sure your listeners do as well. There's probably no business out there that's ever modeled zero revenue as a scenario. When you're scenario planning, you might say, well, God, if things really go badly, maybe we'll see a 20% reduction in revenue, but there's no such thing as, well, why don't we just model 6 months of no revenue? Like that's
Yeah.
never been done, right? So I say all that to say, like, I don't take this idea of social distancing lightly, but you have to be able to put this virus back on its heels, and a big part of that is sort of stopping the spread of a virus that really, if you were designing a virus to be maximally destructive, you would definitely take a few things from the SARS-CoV-2's playbook. It's not the most deadly virus in the world. In other words, this is not a virus that wipes our species off the planet. But if you wanted to make such a virus, you would absolutely take some things that this virus does, namely that it can be very infectious long before you are symptomatic. That's a very powerful tool in a virus's toolkit to spread. So going back to your question, look, I think that the most important thing people can do for their immune system is sleep. I think of all of the levers we pull, getting 8 hours of sleep a night is going to move the needle as much as any. I think other things that matter are exercising every day, but not doing it at a super high intensity. So kind of two types of people, right? There are people that don't exercise enough generally. They need to be exercising more. And then there are probably people like you and I who exercise a lot and probably exercise a little too much and a little too intense. We have to actually dial it back. So I'm, really focusing on exercising every day, but only about an hour and not at the level of intensity that I would normally. And, a lot of it's just body weight stuff. It's just sort of moving. It's just being active. And it's as important for my head as it is for my body. With respect to food, that's been a huge challenge for me. I tend to stress eat a little more than I would care to admit. So I've been kind of just focusing on doing more time restricted feeding. It's just a little easier for me to be binary and, at least say, okay, how about I just don't eat anything for these 18 or 20 hours as opposed to allowing myself the liberty of stress grazing.
Yeah, that I was actually thinking about you the other day. I remember the story that you told about if you have, if I remember right, it was cashews. To have cashews in the house, they have to be hidden, and you can't know where they are. And I thought, whoa, what's he doing in lockdown? Where it's like either to not have anything that you want and it be psychologically taxing in that way because you just can't have anything delicious in the house, or like, does he have to go hide while his wife pulls it out of hiding so that he doesn't see like what part of the house she goes to? I was
Well,
curious
my littlest kid is potty training right now, and his reward is M&Ms. Every time he goes, pee pee on the potty, he gets his M&M. And the problem is, I was just eating them by the handful every time I walked by, and I would rationalize it by saying, "Well, look, I'm using the potty, so I should be allowed to do this." So yeah, we finally had to put the kibosh on that. So the M&Ms are in hiding. I don't get to know where they are, and that's the way it is. As far as, I get asked a lot about supplements and stuff, and I saw some people are asking questions about supplements. I think at this point, there's reasonable evidence that zinc is probably worth taking. The challenge, of course, is in what format. So zinc is not necessarily the most bioavailable thing, depending on how you take it. But, you're generally going to need about, I don't know, call it, 30 to 50 milligrams of a relatively bioavailable zinc. The lozenges, which are typically pretty good, have been kind of sold out on Amazon for quite some time. So, zinc supplementation probably makes a little bit of sense. As far as anything else, I think it's just too hard to say. And my concern with it is that I wouldn't want to give somebody a false sense of confidence that because they're taking, vitamin C or vitamin D, which also is probably quite important, especially if you can't get out into sunlight. So, people who live in parts of the country or the world where they can still, despite a quarantine, get out and get sunshine. I think that's hugely important to get vitamin D in the natural way. If people can't, then I think supplementing vitamin D would also matter. But again, you just don't want people to think that that protects them from washing their hands and things like that.
Yeah.
And of course, distancing from, people who themselves are not able to quarantine.
So going back to the notion that you were talking about with be a little bit careful about, definitely be careful about underworking out, but you actually have to be careful about overworking out. So I have a regimen. I take cold showers every day. I work out every day. I intermittent fast every day. I would love to stop all of them. So you've already addressed the working out. What about cold showers? What about intermittent fasting? What about prolonged fasting? Where in that sort of do hard things to prolong your life regimen do we find that we might be cracking over into creating too much of a stress response?
So let's look at the one area where we have the most data on that, Tom, is exercise. So it's been clearly studied, the different types of exercise and how they trickle into a stress response. So remember, everything that you just described is a short-term stress or hormesis that is meant to produce a long-term adaptation that is beneficial, right? So exercise is stressful, right? Exercise breaks down muscle, it taxes the body, and it's our response to that that is beneficial. So when we look at exercise and we look at sort of modest, low intensity aerobic exercise, we observe that the immune system transiently actually gets stronger, not weaker as a result of that. Conversely, when we look at studies of high intensity interval training, we find a transient reduction in immune system before a bounce back. And again, that's probably because that high intensity training causes an overabundance of stress in the short period of time. And while that produces great physiologic benefits down the line, I think we have to figure out what we're optimizing for. In this moment, are you optimizing to be the fittest version of Tom or the healthiest version? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. So how do we extrapolate that to fasting? Because that's something I think a lot about. Well, I think we also know that prolonged fasting, 3, 4, 5, 7-day fasts actually raise cortisol levels. They're actually quite stressful in the short run. Because evolutionarily, when our ancestors didn't eat for 3 days, that was a bit of a kick in the butt to go out, get food, be more efficient. We require less sleep during periods of intense fasting, in part for that reason. So for that reason, I just don't think this is the time to be doing prolonged fasting. I think the typical 3 to 7-day fast that I do, with great frequency, I'm just going to be holding off on those until I have a little bit more clarity. That said, there's no evidence that short-term, time-restricted feeding is problematic. And I think in many ways, time-restricted feeding is an efficient way for us to manage, if you're someone like me, stress eating, if you're just looking to have a little bit control. I mean, yesterday I did an OMAD, which I haven't done in a while, and I just felt a lot better than I felt during the sort of grazing of food all day, which has
What's
sort
an
of been my
OMAD?
default. Sorry, one meal a day. So I just had, dinner Sunday, dinner Monday. I'll probably just do it again today. I won't eat until I have dinner tonight. So that's
And
kind of a long time restricted feeding.
yeah, for sure. And what do you think about cold exposure? Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I've looked a lot into cold exposure and heat exposure for different reasons. I think cold exposure is quite interesting. Really, the data on cold exposure show, I think, two reasonable lines of benefit. The first is it clearly has a benefit in what's called delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. So if people use cold exposure as a way to recover from training, it definitely shows an improvement in symptoms there. But of course, given that we're not going to be training to the point of crushing ourselves, it's not clear that that's as important. I think the other area where cold immersion seems to be beneficial is probably from a neuro perspective. I think there's reasonable evidence that there are some antidepressive properties of cold immersion, especially with respect to neurotransmitters that have antidepressive benefits. Contrary to popular belief, there's really a complete dearth of evidence suggesting that cold therapy boosts immune function, reduces, other types of inflammation, or generally produces much benefit. I mean, the benefits on heat therapy are much greater than cold therapy. So I'm not, I guess I wouldn't say that cold therapy is necessarily harmful, because I don't think, it produces any downsides. Obviously, mild cold therapy is also known to activate brown fat, which is metabolically quite active. And truthfully, it doesn't occur to me that that would necessarily be a bad thing or necessarily a beneficial thing. So I guess long-winded answer would be, if cold therapy helps you feel better, like literally for some people, I think it is just an amazing antidepressant. This would be a great time for it, because I think for many of us right now, the sort of anxiety and uncertainty of what's going on is itself a burden.
I've seen one thing go through the comments a lot, which is people wanting to know if a multivitamin is something that'll be useful. I'm assuming if it doesn't contain zinc, that it's probably zinc and vitamin D were, as you were talking, sort of the two things I took away as maybe being the most important. But is there a multivitamin that you recommend, or is it a waste?
No, I think multivitamins are not great, because they basically have too little of the things you want and generally more of the things you don't care for. So my view is, if you're going to supplement something, if you believe that you can't get enough vitamin D from sunlight, then you really probably need to just be taking straight up vitamin D3, and probably 2 to 5,000 IU is a sufficient dose. Similarly, if you're not getting enough vitamin C in your diet, you probably ought to just fully supplement vitamin C. And if you're not getting enough of the Bs, B6s, B12s, folic acid, again, this is an important point to consider, right? There are many people who aren't able to get fresh foods the way they once would. So again, those are times when you want to turn to supplementation. But my view is, go directly for the supplement as opposed to the multi. I've never really understood the value of multivitamins except for marketing.
Very fair. So in a time of limited access to foods, if we were going to try to do it all through foods, which I certainly will do my best, I try to get sunlight as close to every day as humanly possible. I'm very fortunate to live in Los Angeles, where it's not exactly a hardship to even just like stick your head out a window. And I've tried to revisit. So obviously I'm in a fortunate position now where it's much easier to deal with being in a quarantine. I'm trying to revisit like what this quarantine would look like at the different phases in my life. When I was dirt poor, didn't even have a balcony, it was like, but there was one window in the house that you could wind open in the kitchen. And it's like, if you legitimately could not walk out your front door, could you at least, stick your head out the window? The importance of getting fresh air. But anyway, that's sort of a side point. What I really wanted to ask was, if we were going to try to do all of this without supplementation, what are the things like, should we be getting red meat? Because I know that red meat contains all the vitamin C that you're going to need. Should we be eating certain leafy greens? Like, what are the like 4 or 5 things, if we know that we only have access to a limited number of sort of widely available things, what would that selection be?
Well, I mean, we have to be careful about assuming we can get enough vitamin C in meat. That's really only true if you're not consuming carbohydrates with it. So in the case of like the Inuit and the Maasai, who were basically just eating meat, you're right, they could get trace amounts of vitamin C in there, but because they didn't have any glucose in their diets, it was sufficient. But if one is, eating meat and potatoes, but not eating, anything that's citrusy, lemons, oranges, things like that, they're probably not getting enough vitamin C, and they might want to supplement it. With respect to vegetables, we've taken a cautious principle internally in our practice now and recommended the following to our patients. Most of us, of course, are getting groceries delivered intermittently. if you're not, lucky enough to have a garden where you can grow your own stuff. We take this idea pretty seriously that you want to be able to assume that any piece of food that comes in your house is carrying a virus on it. And the good thing about this virus is we know that it's quite susceptible to soap and water. It's not like a virus that is unkillable, but you've got to be able to, scrub it with soap and water. So things like lettuce, berries, things where the surfaces are just not amenable to a full cleaning, we're just kind of avoiding. And you've heard me joke about how much I love salad. Every day I need a salad in a bowl the size of my head. So that salad has morphed. So that salad now is, which used to be a very leafy sort of salad, is now basically tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, and bell peppers, which are basically all things you can completely wash, cut up, little olive oil, lemon juice, and away we go. So that's kind of a pivot that I've made on that front. And then, it's also sort of, relying on, so far less fruit than normal. Again, we're fortunate from a meat standpoint because I hunt and we've got a freezer that's just sort of stockpiled with, venison. But again, I just sort of think like it's the biggest issue with respect to food is like trying to minimize the destructive eating. I think it's, I don't think this is a time to make enormous dietary pivots, right? If somebody normally likes to eat red meat, great, keep eating it, but, make it the highest quality that you're able to get and acknowledge that any port in a storm means like half the time when we look at Instacart or whatever we're using to ordering, like you just can't get what you want sometimes. So, you sort of pick and choose your battles. The other thing I want to come back to that I really hope to have a better beat on within the next 2 weeks is what is going to be the availability of protective masks. Because as we go to the point that you raised, you're someone who lives in a tiny apartment building in New York, you barely have a window to look out. What is it going to mean for your sanity to be able to get outside? Well, I think it's going to mean a hell of a lot. And I think the evidence is emerging rapidly in the past few days that, that the proper type of mask is truly protective. Now, again, a month ago, the message was no, this is not the case. And I think there's been some real bungling of this through some of the sort of political responses to this. But I think if you really look at the proper use of an N95 mask, I think it is both a great tool to protect a person who's wearing it from others and to protect others from the person wearing it. In other words, I think there really is emerging evidence that if we were all going to walk around with masks outside and take great precaution, we could start to mobilize a little more than we are. So what I'm hoping is we get to a point where the production of those masks is ramped up. Now, 3M, which is the leading manufacturer of the N95 mask, is able to make, I want to say 35 million of those masks a month. So or maybe it's a week, and of course it matters greatly. The point is whatever they're able to make right now is probably going to take us a while to have a sufficient number of these things. Right. I think that's a week. So we've I think we're still early in the days of knowing that everybody can have sufficient access to these things. And obviously you have to prioritize who gets them first, and nobody needs them more than healthcare workers. But I do hope that, a month from now, we're sitting here having this discussion when everybody's got an N95 mask, and that is opening up the door for them to actually get outside and start to interact with the world again. Because I think that's, it's a real, challenge for everybody that's in quarantine.
Yeah, mental health is obviously, with what I do and the thing that I guess I know about in terms of dealing with the public, that's been huge. A lot of questions around that, and I think that there's going to be a lot of it. It isn't as much of a part of the public discourse in terms of this effect on people's psychology. We don't have a lot of time left with you. So one, I want to ask, is there anything that you think that people can do during quarantine to optimize for that? Whether that's to, hey, do body weight workouts because of the, BDNF and things that are going to help you pull yourself psychologically or physiologically out of a bad psychological state? Or is it just is there any optimistic news that you can impart around what's going on with COVID-19? That would be amazing.
There, as you probably know, Tom, we're putting out podcasts at a great clip right now, far more than our normal clip. And every podcast we put out in the last 3 weeks, including one that's going to come out today, I mean, they're just exclusively geared to this. None of the content is behind a paywall. And I would just kind of direct people to that. So, for example, interview I had with Ryan Holiday a week ago was just a great, really dealing with the psychology of this stuff. In fact, we've had two episodes, one with Sam Harris and one with Rick Elias. I mean, pardon me, with um, Ryan Holiday, that have just dealt with sort of these questions. And one of the things that Ryan brought up that I really liked was the difference between dead time and alive time. So, you know, we don't have much control over the fact that we're all kind of quarantined, but there's a way to sort of take that situation and make something great of it. And look, it's tempting to say maybe I'm just going to sit here and watch Netflix all day long, but that's kind of dead time, right? And so maybe watch Netflix for an hour a day, but spend time reading, completely unplugging from the situation and going through those novels you have not had the time to look through. Or picking up a hobby, like there are other little goofy things I'm trying to make time to do every day that don't seem to add much value to my immediate life, but they're a great distraction. We talk a lot about Winston Churchill in this podcast and how he kind of coped with this never-ending stress of the Second World War, and how despite that still found time to be still. So I think that the mental health component of this, Tom, is enormous, and it's only going to get more important as time goes on. And in fact, I was reading an article this morning that talked about the psychological fallout of each of the previous pandemics, from the 1918 flu to SARS, MERS, and H1N1. And actually, it's very disturbing, some of the lingering trends we see both in healthcare workers who face protracted burnout following these things, and also a number of the people who have been in quarantine and then all of a sudden start to develop phobias that make it harder for them to go out even when the quarantine's over. So I'm glad people are paying attention to this now, because I think it's going to be an enormous area of attention. It's going to need to be an enormous area of attention, regardless of how this thing resolves.
Yeah. So that word attention, I think, is super critical for people to hear. Whatever you point your attention at, you're going to see more of. And look, this is certainly not an easy time, but the only thing that I think is going to make it worse for people is if you focus on all of the negative, if you focus on all the ways that things are going wrong. We started the podcast, or whatever this is, the IG Live, by talking about, some of the ways that people are coming together and the ways that people have been offering their assistance to you for free, just to help you model things out. People that in any other time, certainly in our lifetimes, would have been pointed at, something else, something probably revenue generating. And there really is this cool other thing happening, that is people doing their best to reach out, to connect, to find, find ways to do things with their time, like you said, to make it more alive time. So I'm super interested in that. And I think that trying to get people to understand that they control their attention and what it gets aimed at will be huge. I hadn't thought of Winston Churchill in this context, but that's actually really interesting. And I forget who said it, but there's a quote about meditation, which is, if you don't have 10 minutes to meditate, you're the person who needs to meditate the most. And I think that that's really true. And for people to take time to really begin to, get their head in the right place is going to be pretty critical. I've heard you talk about how you've been a little more irritable through this. What have you done to deal with that? What are you doing to focus yourself on something that stays in a more positive direction?
I'm trying to be more attentive to my emotions. So I tend to suppress them and ignore them, and they only become apparent when I'm about to erupt. So it's like I sort of live on an emotional binary scale. I'm digitally emotional, like 0, 1, 0, 1, and I'm trying to be more analog, right? Like a rheostat. So that means, you know, when my kids are just completely driving me bananas, I try to hit pause a little sooner in the process and say, is it really upsetting you that they're doing this or that? Or are you actually upset about something else and you're starting to displace your tension towards them? it's actually made a really big difference. I mean, that sounds like a very cliche thing to do, but this very deliberate focus on doing what's called an emotional check-in has been really powerful. And ever since I had that really bad couple of days where I was just like kind of losing my mind and flipping out at the kids over seemingly nothing, these very frequent emotional check-ins have been a helpful way to do it. And of course, if you can do it with somebody, if you can do it with your spouse, and it doesn't have to be somebody in person, I think that's a really valuable thing to do. Is just to be able to say, look, man, I feel scared today. Like, and every day I sort of, my wife asks for my sort of temperature, how are you feeling today? And I'm like, some days I'm like, oh, I'm totally optimistic. Like, we're gonna, this is gonna happen. This is gonna happen. This is gonna happen. And there's other days, and I'm like last night, I was just really depressed, and I went to bed, and I was like, this is gonna be a disaster. And again, neither of those extremes are likely true, but how you feel definitely impacts how you color the world.
Yeah, that is for sure. Well, my friend, thank you so much for joining me, dude. It is always awesome to connect with you and spend a few minutes together. Your insights are absolutely extraordinary. Thank you for being on the front lines of this, for making so much of your content available to everybody. The resources that you have at your command, not the least of which your own mind, is unbelievable, man. And I am super excited that I live in a world where you're putting out this content. It's a game changer. So thanks for showing up. Thanks for talking people through this difficult time. And hopefully I will connect with you soon.
Thanks, man. Be well.
All right, same. Everybody out there, be safe, take care of yourself, wash those hands, get some sunlight, eat right, exercise a little bit, but not too much. And we will get through this. I promise. Keep your head right, everybody. All right, peace out. Take care.